It began on an afternoon when the sky itself seemed unwilling to witness what pride was about to accomplish. Thick autumn clouds gathered above Ashcombe Hall, swallowing the pale sun until the sprawling stone manor stood beneath a veil of silver gloom. Rain clung to the carved gargoyles along the roof, dripped from marble balustrades, and darkened the gravel drive where elegant carriages stood waiting. Servants lined the entrance with lowered eyes while members of the neighboring aristocracy lingered beneath black umbrellas, pretending concerned though their eager whispers betrayed a hunger for scandal that no respectable drawing-room could ever satisfy. Within those murmuring circles stood Eleanor Ashcombe, Duchess of Ashcombe, scarcely 23 years of age, yet carrying upon her weary shoulders the sorrow of a lifetime. Her sapphire traveling cloak concealed a once magnificent ivory gown now softened by months of sleepless nights. In her trembling arms rested her infant daughter, wrapped in fine wool embroidered with tiny forget-me-nots, blissfully unaware that her entire future hung upon the judgment of strangers. Eleanor neither begged nor protested. She merely held the child closer, as though every heartbeat she offered could shield the little girl from the cruelty gathering around them. The whispers drifted through the damp air like poisonous smoke. Some claimed the babe had arrived too soon after the wedding. Others repeated darker rumors carefully planted by those who benefited from doubt. Every glance lingered upon the infant's delicate face, searching desperately for proof that she belonged to another man. Compassion became a luxury no one dared display. Reputation weighed more heavily than truth inside noble circles, and the assembled guests understood that before evening fell, one woman's honor would either survive or perish forever. At the top of the broad staircase appeared Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Ashcombe, dressed in immaculate black with a white cravat fastened so perfectly that no one would have guessed sleep had abandoned him for weeks. Tall, commanding, and devastatingly handsome, he possessed the sort of quiet authority that silenced entire ballrooms with a single glance. Yet today his gray eyes carried something unfamiliar. Beneath the polished restraint flickered uncertainty, almost grief, though he buried it beneath the rigid posture expected of generations of Ashcombe dukes. Beside him stood Dowager Duchess Beatrice, elegant as carved marble and nearly as merciless. Her gloved fingers rested lightly upon an ebony cane while satisfaction glimmered beneath carefully controlled features. At her other side waited Lord Cedric Hawthorne, Julian's ambitious cousin whose charming smile concealed relentless calculation. A few steps behind lingered the family solicitor, clutching legal documents with solemn precision. Together they formed an unyielding wall of influence, surrounding the Duke before he had spoken a single word. Julian descended each stone step with measured dignity until only several feet separated husband from wife. Rain tapped softly against the carriage roofs while every soul present held its breath. Eleanor lifted her eyes to meet his. They had once shared silent promises across candlelit ballrooms, exchanged shy smiles beneath flowering gardens, and whispered dreams beside roaring fireplaces. Now an ocean wider than kingdoms stretched between them. "My lord," she said quietly, her voice carrying neither accusation nor fear, "look upon your daughter before others persuade you never to do so again." For one suspended moment, Julian's gaze settled upon the sleeping infant. Tiny fingers emerged from the blanket, reaching instinctively toward the air. Something inside him visibly faltered. His jaw tightened. His shoulders rose with an unsteady breath. Eleanor believed, if only for that heartbeat, that love would triumph over suspicion. Then Lady Beatrice spoke with icy softness. "Mercy without certainty destroys noble houses." Cedric added, almost regretfully, "The realm watches, your grace. Weakness today invites disgrace for generations." The poison of pride settled once more around Julian's heart. His expression hardened until it resembled the weathered stone behind him. Every trace of tenderness disappeared beneath centuries of inherited expectation. When he finally spoke, his words echoed across the silent courtyard with devastating clarity. "Neither this woman nor that child shall ever bear my name." No thunder followed. No dramatic cry escaped the gathering. The quiet itself became unbearable. Eleanor closed her eyes only briefly. A single tear escaped despite every effort to preserve her composure. Without argument, she slipped the Ashcombe wedding ring from her finger. The gold felt strangely warm, carrying memories of vows spoken before God beneath cathedral light. She placed it carefully upon the lowest stone step between them, neither throwing it away nor offering it back with anger. "I pray," she whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead, "that heaven teaches you the truth no earthly pride can silence." She turned before anyone could witness another tear. Her modest traveling bag was lifted into the waiting carriage by an elderly servant whose trembling hands betrayed silent heartbreak. No farewell came from the manor. Only the slow groan of iron gates opening to exile. As horses began pulling the carriage through falling rain, an aged physician emerged beneath the portico, clutching sealed medical papers against his chest. Watching the departing mother and child vanish beyond the estate, he bowed his head and murmured, barely above a breath, "Your Grace. Heaven forgive what you have done." Winter surrendered slowly to spring before the wounds left by Ashcombe Hall began to scar over. The seasons changed with quiet determination, yet Eleanor carried the memory of that rain-soaked farewell through every dawn and every lonely evening. She settled beneath her maiden name in the peaceful fishing village of Whitehaven, where the sea breathed against weathered cliffs and gulls circled above humble cottages instead of grand estates. Few people questioned her past. Those who noticed the refinement of her speech accepted only what she offered, sensing that certain sorrows deserved respectful silence rather than curious conversation. The small cottage she rented overlooked a narrow harbor where fishing boats departed before sunrise and returned with silver catches beneath crimson sunsets. Its whitewashed walls bore little resemblance to Ashcombe Hall's soaring galleries, yet warmth lingered within every room. A modest hearth glowed through cool evenings, dried lavender scented the windowsills, and laughter gradually replaced the silence that grief had once claimed. Eleanor discovered that comfort was not measured by chandeliers or polished marble, but by the absence of fear within one's own home. Her daughter, whom she named Rose, flourished beneath gentle hands instead of noble expectations. Bright-eyed and endlessly curious, the child greeted each morning with delighted wonder, reaching toward dancing shafts of sunlight as though every day were a precious miracle. Eleanor devoted herself entirely to the little girl, weaving stories beside the fire, singing forgotten lullabies learned from her own mother, and whispering prayers that Rose would inherit compassion rather than bitterness. Whenever memories threatened to harden her heart, the child's innocent smile dissolved them before resentment could take root. Money remained scarce, yet Eleanor refused every invitation to seek charity. She taught reading, handwriting, and music to village children whose parents offered fresh bread, firewood, or modest coins in return. She visited elderly widows carrying baskets of soup, stitched worn garments for struggling families, and quietly comforted mothers whose husbands had vanished at sea. Without realizing it, she became the quiet heartbeat of Whitehaven, admired not because she claimed importance but because she never reminded anyone of sacrifices they could plainly see. Each evening, after Rose had fallen asleep, Eleanor opened a small cedar box hidden beneath her bed. Inside rested every letter Julian had written during their courtship, tied neatly with faded blue ribbon. The ink carried promises of lifelong devotion, whispered dreams of children running through Ashcombe Gardens, and declarations that love would always stand above duty. She never unfolded a single page. Preserving those words untouched somehow felt kinder than discovering whether memory had embroidered them into something they had never truly been. Closing the box each night became an act of farewell she could never completely finish. Far away, Ashcombe Hall stood unchanged in stone yet transformed in spirit. The grand ballroom remained polished, but music seldom echoed beneath its glittering chandeliers. Long dining tables welcomed distinguished guests whose conversations drifted politely around the Duke's failed marriage without daring to name it directly. Servants moved with careful efficiency, though cheerful laughter had disappeared from corridors once brightened by Eleanor's kindness. Even the gardens seemed strangely subdued, their roses blooming without the joy that had once inspired their careful tending. Julian immersed himself in estate affairs with relentless discipline. Contracts, harvest reports, charitable obligations, and parliamentary correspondence filled every waking hour, leaving little opportunity for reflection. Society praised his composure while quietly questioning why no suitable bride accepted his courtship. Families eager for noble alliances suddenly hesitated. Some feared hidden scandal. Others distrusted a man capable of dismissing wife and child so publicly. Invitations grew fewer. Conversations shortened. The admiration he once commanded slowly surrendered to cautious distance. Late one gray afternoon, tragedy visited the estate without ceremony. The elderly physician who had served 3 generations of Ashcombes collapsed inside his study before finishing a final letter. When servants discovered him, his hand still rested protectively upon a locked leather case bearing the Duke's seal. Julian attended the funeral with genuine sorrow, remembering the gentle man who had treated childhood fevers and offered quiet wisdom throughout difficult years. Only afterward did the family solicitor deliver the physician's final bequest into Julian's reluctant hands. Within the worn case lay meticulous medical journals, signed witness statements, and sealed correspondence dated before Rose's birth. Julian broke the crimson wax with trembling fingers. Each page dismantled another certainty upon which he had condemned his family. The physician described Eleanor's dangerous pregnancy in painstaking detail, explaining complications that required early delivery to preserve both mother and child. Additional testimonies from nurses, midwives, and consulting physicians confirmed identical conclusions. Every signature echoed the same devastating truth. Rose had never been another man's daughter. She had always been his. The room seemed suddenly too small to contain the weight of revelation. Julian staggered toward the library window as memories returned with merciless clarity. Eleanor's pleading eyes, her trembling voice, the infant's tiny outstretched hand, the wedding ring resting upon cold stone. None had been performances crafted by deception. They had been the final gestures of an innocent wife abandoned by the man sworn to protect her. Shame settled upon him heavier than any title ever had. His reflection in the rain-darkened glass appeared unfamiliar, stripped of certainty and dignity alike. Long after darkness swallowed the estate, Julian remained alone beside the dying fire, clutching the physician's papers as though they burned his hands. At last he whispered into the silent room, "I banished the only soul who never betrayed me." Before dawn touched the eastern sky, he ordered his horse saddled, leaving Ashcombe Hall behind with only one desperate purpose filling his heart: to find the woman he had wronged before forgiveness became forever beyond his reach. Snow arrived early that year, blanketing the countryside in quiet white until roads, hedgerows, and distant hills appeared softened by heaven's own hand. Julian rode through the frozen landscape with relentless determination, his cloak stiffened by frost and his weary horse breathing clouds into the brittle morning air. Every village he visited carried another fragment of Eleanor's trail. A kindly innkeeper remembered a graceful widow teaching children. A fisherman recalled a young mother singing beside the harbor. An elderly woman pointed toward Whitehaven, smiling as though speaking of someone whose goodness had become common knowledge. Each answer filled Julian with equal measures of hope and unbearable regret. When he finally reached the little coastal village, the sea stretched beneath a pale winter sky, restless yet strangely peaceful. Modest cottages overlooked the harbor, their chimneys sending gentle ribbons of smoke into the cold air. Nothing resembled the grandeur of Ashcombe Hall. There were no towering gates, no marble fountains, no liveried servants awaiting commands. Yet life flourished here with a sincerity Julian had not witnessed within noble walls for many years. Children laughed while chasing one another across the snow, fishermen repaired weathered nets, and neighbors greeted each passerby by name rather than title. Julian dismounted quietly, unwilling to disturb the fragile peace surrounding the place Eleanor had chosen. As he walked along the narrow lane, his attention settled upon a little girl kneeling beside a snow-covered garden. She wore a woolen blue coat, oversized mittens, and a knitted bonnet that slipped sideways whenever she laughed. Tiny hands carefully shaped snow into the form of a crooked rabbit while humming a tune he recognized from evenings Eleanor once played upon the pianoforte. The melody struck him harder than any accusation ever could. The child glanced upward, noticing the unfamiliar gentleman standing nearby. Instead of shrinking behind caution, she smiled with fearless curiosity. Her gray eyes mirrored his own so perfectly that his breath caught inside his chest. Before Julian found words, she rose, hurried across the snowy path, and stopped only inches away. "Mister," she asked brightly, "would you help me give my rabbit proper ears?" The innocent request shattered every wall pride had built around his heart. Julian slowly knelt, his gloved hands trembling as he reshaped the snow. Rose watched attentively before clapping with delighted approval. Without hesitation, she threw her tiny arms around his neck in gratitude. The unexpected embrace nearly undid him. He closed his eyes for one impossible moment, feeling the warmth of the daughter he had rejected before ever knowing her name. The cottage door opened softly. Eleanor stood upon the threshold holding a basket of freshly baked bread. Time had refined rather than diminished her quiet beauty. Simplicity replaced aristocratic splendor, yet dignity surrounded her more completely than any jeweled gown ever had. Surprise flashed across her face before composure returned with practiced grace. Her gaze lingered upon Julian holding their daughter, and something painfully tender flickered within her eyes before disappearing beneath calm restraint. "Rose," she said gently, "come inside." The little girl looked between them with cheerful confusion. "But mother," he made the rabbit smile. Eleanor offered Julian a measured nod. "If you have traveled this far, your grace, it would be discourteous to leave you standing in the snow." Inside, warmth embraced them through the crackling hearth and the comforting fragrance of fresh bread. The modest room glowed with candlelight reflecting against polished wooden furniture lovingly repaired instead of replaced. Julian removed his gloves while Rose busied herself arranging painted wooden toys upon the floor. The ordinary peace surrounding mother and daughter carried a richness no palace banquet had ever possessed. Silence settled before Julian finally spoke. "I have read the physician's journals." Eleanor neither flinched nor appeared surprised. "Then you know the truth." "I know I condemned innocence." She lowered her eyes briefly. "Yes." Julian struggled to steady his voice. "I believed those I trusted." "You chose them," Eleanor answered softly, "over the woman who trusted only you." No anger sharpened her words. Their gentleness wounded far more deeply. "I have repeated that day 1,000 times, Julian confessed. "Each memory reveals another kindness I ignored. Another plea I refused to hear. You remember because guilt forces remembrance. I remember because love survived my cowardice." The room fell still except for the cheerful crackle of burning logs. Julian stepped closer, every polished certainty abandoned. "I loved you from the evening we first danced. I love you still. Yet when my family demanded proof, I lacked the courage to defend the wife who deserved unwavering faith. I feared scandal more than losing you. By the time truth arrived, I had destroyed everything worth protecting." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the teacup she held. "You did not lose us that day, Your Grace." She lifted her eyes, filled neither with hatred nor forgiveness. "You abandoned us." Those words settled between them like winter itself. Rose wandered toward Julian carrying a small carved horse. "Would you play?" The child knew nothing of betrayal. Julian accepted the toy with grateful humility. For the next hour he sat upon the rug, building imaginary villages from wooden blocks, listening to Rose invent marvelous adventures where everyone found their way home before nightfall. Her laughter filled every corner of the cottage, each joyful sound exposing another future he had carelessly surrendered. Eleanor watched quietly from beside the hearth, seeing tenderness she had once believed buried forever beneath inherited pride. As twilight darkened the windows, Julian reluctantly prepared to leave. From his pocket he withdrew the heavy Ashcombe signet ring, its crest gleaming within the firelight. He placed it gently upon the mantel beside a single dried lavender stem. "It belongs with you," he whispered. Eleanor regarded the ring for several silent moments before carefully placing it beside the hearth instead. "A ring," she said, "cannot restore what pride destroyed." Her quiet refusal lingered after Julian stepped into the snow, carrying hope fragile enough to break with the very next sunrise. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of worn silver, and the peaceful rhythm Eleanor had built in Whitehaven fractured before the first church bell finished ringing. A rider from the neighboring town delivered a sealed note, refusing payment and leaving as quickly as he had come. The handwriting belonged to Mrs. Ashcroft, an elderly governess who had once served at Ashcombe Hall and remained one of the few souls who had quietly shown Eleanor kindness. With careful fingers Eleanor unfolded the page, her expression growing still as each line revealed another shadow from the past. Lady Beatrice had discovered Rose's whereabouts. The Dowager Duchess had not softened with age or regret. According to the letter, she considered the child an Ashcombe heir only because undeniable proof now existed, and she intended to secure the family bloodline before Julian's newfound affection weakened his resolve. Lawyers were already preparing petitions. Trusted servants had been ordered to travel north. If persuasion failed, influence would succeed. Society would applaud the reunion while never asking whether the little girl or her mother desired such a fate. Eleanor lowered the letter into the fire without another word. The flames consumed every sentence until nothing remained except drifting ash. She had once trusted the protection of titles and vows, only to discover how quickly both could disappear beneath suspicion. She would never again allow powerful voices to decide her daughter's future. Whatever affection Julian now carried could not erase the forces surrounding his name. Rose looked up from the table where she had been coloring flowers onto scraps of paper. "Mother, are we going somewhere?" Eleanor forced a gentle smile. "Yes, my darling. We are taking a journey." "Will the kind gentleman come too?" The innocent question pierced her heart. "I do not know." She packed only what mattered. Warm clothing, treasured books, family photographs, the cedar box containing Julian's unopened courtship letters, and Rose's favorite carved horse disappeared into two modest trunks. Nothing else seemed worth carrying. Wealth had once surrounded Eleanor in abundance, yet loss had taught her that memory traveled more faithfully than possessions. By nightfall a trusted fisherman arranged passage aboard a merchant vessel departing at first light for Scotland, where Eleanor intended to seek refuge with distant relatives who had never bowed to aristocratic politics. Before dawn, a simple carriage waited outside the cottage while snow drifted silently through the sleeping village. Eleanor took one final look at the home that had restored her dignity. She whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude before lifting Rose into the carriage. The horses began moving just as the eastern horizon softened with pale light. Less than an hour later, Julian returned to Whitehaven carrying fresh bread, children's storybooks, and a small wooden doll he had carved himself during a sleepless night. Hope accompanied every step toward Eleanor's cottage. He had spent days reflecting upon her words, determined not to demand forgiveness but to earn the privilege of seeking it. He knocked once. No answer came. He knocked again. Only silence greeted him. An elderly neighbor cautiously approached, removing her shawl against the bitter wind. "They left before sunrise, Your Grace." Julian's face drained of color. "Left?" The mother said nothing except that some storms return wearing familiar faces. The basket slipped from Julian's grasp. Bread scattered across the snow beside the unfinished doll. "Which road?" The woman pointed toward the northern highway leading to the harbor. Without another word, Julian raced toward the stable. Within moments he was mounted, urging his powerful black stallion into a furious gallop. Snow exploded beneath iron hooves while icy wind clawed at his face. Every heartbeat echoed with the same terrifying certainty. He had been granted one impossible chance, and now it was vanishing beyond the horizon because the ghosts of his own mistakes refused to release them. The road twisted through frozen woodlands where bare branches reached across the sky like pleading hands. Carriage tracks remained visible beneath fresh snowfall, urging him onward. He crossed narrow stone bridges glazed with ice, splashed through half-frozen streams, and rode across open fields where fierce winds threatened to throw both horse and rider into the drifts. Exhaustion burned inside his lungs, yet fear proved stronger than pain. Inside the carriage, Rose watched snowflakes dance against the window. "Mother?" "Yes." "Why are you crying?" Eleanor touched her cheek, surprised to find tears there. "I did not realize I was." "Is it because we're leaving the gentleman?" For several moments she could not answer. Finally she whispered, "Sometimes loving someone is not enough to make the world safe." Behind them, the thunder of galloping hooves gradually emerged through the wind. The coachman glanced over his shoulder. "My lady, someone is gaining on us." Julian leaned low over his horse's neck, refusing to surrender another precious minute. Every apology he had rehearsed seemed pitiful against the years Eleanor had endured alone. He no longer rode as a duke defending reputation. He rode as a husband desperate to become worthy of the family he had broken. The harbor finally appeared ahead, its gray waters churning beneath a restless winter sky. Merchant ships waited beyond the docks, sails fluttering impatiently. If Eleanor reached the vessel, distance might accomplish what pride had begun years earlier. Summoning the last of his strength, Julian urged his stallion forward. The horse surged alongside the carriage. "Stop!" Julian shouted, his voice breaking against the wind. "Please, stop." The coachman hesitated. Eleanor closed her eyes. "Stop the carriage." The wheels slowed before coming to rest beside the snow-covered road leading toward the harbor. Julian dismounted so quickly he nearly stumbled, then crossed the frozen ground without concern for dignity or watching eyes. Villagers, sailors, and travelers paused to witness the extraordinary scene unfolding before them. When he reached the carriage door, Julian dropped to both knees in the snow. He lifted his face toward Eleanor, tears unhidden at last. "Do not forgive me because I deserve it," he pleaded, his voice trembling with honest remorse. "Forgive me because our daughter deserves a father who has finally learned what love demands." Silence answered him. Then the carriage door slowly opened, and little Rose reached out her tiny hand toward the man kneeling in the snow while Eleanor remained motionless behind her, her unreadable expression holding the fate of all three hearts suspended between farewell and forever. Rose's tiny hand hovered between her parents like the smallest bridge ever built, fragile enough to disappear with a single careless breath. Snow drifted quietly around the halted carriage while the harbor fell into reverent silence. Sailors abandoned their ropes, merchants paused beside loaded wagons, and villagers watched without speaking. No one present could fully understand the years of grief compressed into that single moment, yet every witness recognized that pride and love stood facing one another upon the frozen road. Julian remained on his knees. The cold seeped through his clothing, but he welcomed the discomfort. It was insignificant beside the suffering he had inflicted upon the woman before him. For the first time since inheriting the Ashcombe title, He carried neither the authority of a duke nor the certainty of privilege. He possessed only remorse and the desperate hope that truth, however delayed, might still carry enough strength to save what remained of his family. Rose leaned farther from the carriage until Eleanor gently steadied her. "Mother," the little girl whispered, "he looks sad." "He is sad," Eleanor answered softly. "Can sadness be mended?" Eleanor closed her eyes for the briefest moment. "Sometimes," she replied. "But only when it is accompanied by honesty." Julian heard every word. He slowly rose to his feet but kept a respectful distance from the carriage door. He understood at last that forgiveness could never be demanded, purchased, or hurried. It had to be earned through steadfast devotion, one faithful choice at a time. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I have spent every mile of this journey searching for words worthy of your pain. I have found none. Every apology sounds smaller than the wound I created." She regarded him with calm eyes that no longer reflected fear. During the months apart, grief had refined her into someone stronger than the timid bride who had once entered Ashcombe Hall believing love alone could conquer inherited prejudice. "You cannot return the nights our daughter cried without her father," she said. "You cannot restore the trust that died upon those manor steps. You cannot erase the humiliation of hearing my husband deny his own child before strangers. I know. You cannot ask me to forget. I never will." The simplicity of his answer settled between them more powerfully than any dramatic declaration. Eleanor stepped from the carriage, her boots sinking gently into the untouched snow. The winter wind tugged softly at her dark cloak while Rose remained safely inside, watching with solemn curiosity. Eleanor walked only a few paces before stopping. "If there is to be any future," she said, "it will not resemble our past." Julian nodded immediately. "It cannot. You once allowed others to decide who deserved your loyalty. I did. You will never do so again. Never. You will not separate me from my daughter for any reason. I swear it. You will never ask her to choose between her mother and her father. I could not bear such cruelty." Eleanor studied his face carefully. She searched not for eloquence but for consistency, not for polished speeches but for quiet conviction. The proud young nobleman who had bowed before family pressure had disappeared. Before her stood a man humbled by irreversible consequences, and humility had softened him in ways power never could. "There is one final condition," she said. "Name it." "You will not reclaim us in private while allowing society to remember the lie. The truth that destroyed our lives must be spoken where the falsehood was first celebrated." Julian did not hesitate. "It shall be." 3 days later Ashcombe Hall welcomed the largest gathering it had hosted in years. Nobles, magistrates, clergy, neighboring landowners and respected townspeople filled the grand ballroom beneath glittering chandeliers. Many assumed the Duke intended to announce a political alliance or celebrate the discovery of his lawful heir. Whispers flowed through the crowd as elegantly dressed guests speculated about Eleanor's unexpected return. Lady Beatrice entered with regal confidence, convinced that control had finally returned to the Ashcombe family. Lord Cedric stood nearby wearing his familiar smile, believing recent events had strengthened rather than weakened the family's standing. Then Julian entered the ballroom. He did not walk alone. Eleanor stood beside him wearing a graceful sapphire gown whose quiet elegance surpassed every jewel in the room. Rose walked proudly between them, holding both parents' hands. The sight silenced hundreds of conversations at once. Julian led his family to the center of the ballroom before turning toward the assembled guests. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying effortlessly through the vast chamber, "years ago I stood before witnesses and committed the greatest injustice of my life. No one moved. No one interrupted. I accused my wife without evidence. I denied my own daughter because I valued suspicion above love and pride above truth." Lady Beatrice stiffened. Cedric's confident smile vanished. Julian continued. "The physician's records, supported by every attending nurse and physician, proved beyond doubt that Eleanor never betrayed me. The betrayal belonged entirely to me." A stunned murmur spread across the room. He raised one hand for silence. "I do not ask society to forget my failure. I ask only that it remember the woman who endured it with greater dignity than I deserved." Julian turned toward Eleanor. "In this house, before every witness who once heard my cruel words, I now declare that Eleanor Ashcombe is, and has always been, the rightful Duchess of Ashcombe." He looked lovingly toward Rose. "And this precious child is my lawful daughter, my heir, and the greatest blessing I nearly cast away." Lady Beatrice stepped forward, her composure finally cracking. "Julian, consider what you are doing. He faced his mother with sorrow rather than anger. "I have considered it every hour since I learned the truth. You shame your family." "No," he answered steadily. "I am ending the shame my family allowed." His gaze shifted toward Cedric. "And those who encourage deception, manipulation, and falsehood will no longer hold influence within this estate." Cedric attempted a measured protest. "You cannot dismiss blood." Julian's expression hardened with quiet authority. "I cannot change blood. I can change whom I choose to trust." Before the astonished assembly, he removed the signet ring from his hand. He turned toward Eleanor. Months earlier she had refused the same ring beside a humble fireplace because it represented authority without repentance. Now it represented something entirely different. Julian did not attempt to place it upon her finger. Instead he held it in his open palm. "I once believed this ring gave me power," he said. "I was wrong. It only reminded me of responsibilities I failed to honor. Whether you wear it again is entirely your choice." The ballroom waited in absolute silence. Eleanor looked first at the ring, then at Rose, whose hopeful eyes reflected both innocence and possibility. Finally she extended her hand. She did not take the ring immediately. She gently closed Julian's fingers around it. "You will keep it," she said. "For now." Confusion flickered across several faces. She smiled faintly. "Not because I reject our future, but because every promise must be lived before it is celebrated. One day, when our daughter sees trust instead of regret between us, you may ask me again." Tears filled Julian's eyes. "Then I shall spend every day earning that question." Months passed, and true change revealed itself not through grand ceremonies but through ordinary moments. The Duke, who had once hidden behind rank, now read bedtime stories beside the nursery fire, walked through the village without escort, listened before speaking, and treated every servant with sincere respect. Eleanor no longer carried her burdens alone, while Rose grew surrounded by laughter instead of whispered scandal. Spring returned to Ashcombe Hall, covering the gardens with roses more radiant than any remembered in years. One golden afternoon, Rose ran laughing through the blooming paths, her parents following at an unhurried pace. She stopped beneath an ancient oak and stretched out both hands. Without thinking, Eleanor reached with one hand. Julian reached with the other. Rose joined them together. Neither parent pulled away. The little girl beamed as though she had accomplished something magnificent. Perhaps she had. 4 titles could command estates, fortunes could purchase influence, and reputations could shape history, but only humility, steadfast love, and the courage to choose one another every single day could rebuild a family once shattered by pride. And in that quiet garden, where forgiveness blossomed more slowly than roses yet endured far longer, 3 hearts finally discovered that a last chance is never truly about returning to what was lost. It is about becoming worthy of what still remains.